I built that workshop with my own two hands on a piece of land nobody wanted. My daughter drove up to it last Christmas like she was pulling into a valet lot at a hotel she hadn't decided to like yet. That tells you everything you need to know about how we got here. Welcome back, folks. If you're joining me for the first time, I'm glad you found this. Hit subscribe and stay till the end, because this one matters. And if you've ever had someone you gave everything to look at what you built and decide it was never quite enough, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Before I tell you about my daughter, I need to tell you about a woman named Carol Sims. Carol started working for me 22 years ago at Hadley Custom Millwork out on Route 7 in Western Virginia, just past the grain elevator, in a building I'd been renting since 1987 and finally bought outright in 1999. She came in answering an ad I'd run in the Penny Saver for a bookkeeper, part-time, flexible hours. She showed up for the interview in a cardigan, with a notepad already open and a list of questions she wanted to ask me. Nobody had ever brought questions to one of my interviews before. I hired her that afternoon. Carol is 61 now. She's been there through 3 recessions, 2 floods that took out the lower storage room, the year we almost lost the county contract, and the year we got it back. When my wife Patricia got her diagnosis, the first one, in 2018, Carol is the one who quietly reorganized my entire schedule without being asked, moved every client meeting to mornings so I could be at the hospital by 1, and never once made me feel like the shop was suffering for it. When Patricia died 14 months later, Carol closed the office for 2 days. She came back on the 3rd, had the invoices caught up, and left a covered dish on my workbench with a note that just said, "You don't have to say anything." I've never forgotten that. I never will. My name is George Hadley. I'm 64 years old. I own Hadley Custom Millwork, and I've been building things with my hands since I was 15 years old, following my uncle around job sites in Roanoke. I know how to make something that lasts. What I didn't know, or maybe what I knew, and kept choosing not to see, was that you can spend a lifetime building the wrong things for the wrong people and call it love. My daughter's name is Renee. She's 31. She's sharp, persuasive, the kind of person who walks into a room and immediately understands its social geometry. When she was in high school, I used to tell people she could sell a screen door to a submarine captain. I said it with pride. I'm telling you that now so you understand I'm not a father who missed who his daughter was. I saw her clearly. I just kept finding reasons to call what I saw by a softer name. After college, Renee moved to Charlotte. She built a life there, an apartment she decorated like a magazine spread, a social circle I mostly heard about through Instagram, a job in marketing at a firm downtown that she described as fine for now every single time I asked about it. I paid her last 2 semesters of college when her financial aid fell short. I co-signed the lease on her first Charlotte apartment because her credit wasn't established. When she totaled her car on I-85 in 2021 and the insurance didn't cover the gap, I wired her $4,000 by the following morning. No questions, because that's what I told myself fathers do. I told myself that for a long time. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in November, while I was in the middle of cutting crown molding for a kitchen renovation over in Staunton. My cell was on the workbench, and Carol came to get me because she could see by the number that it was Renee, and Renee almost never called during work hours, so we both knew it wasn't nothing. I pulled off my safety glasses and answered it. "Dad, I need to talk to you about the property." She meant the land. About 3.5 acres behind the shop that I've owned free and clear since 2004. Land that Patricia and I had always talked about building a proper house on someday. Land that someday never became, because life kept getting in the way. And then Patricia got sick, and then she was gone. And the land just sat there, being mine, quietly, the way land does. I told her I was listening. She said she and a friend, a man named Derek I'd met exactly once, at a birthday dinner in Charlotte, where he spent most of the evening telling me about a real estate development concept he was working on. She and Derek wanted to build on that land. Not a house, a short-term rental property. 4 units. They had a contractor lined up, she said. They had projections. All they needed was for me to sign the land over as their equity stake in the project, because Derek's financing required it, and because, she said, and I'm going to give you her exact words because I've run them through my head more times than I'd care to count. It's just sitting there, Dad. You're not doing anything with it. It might as well work for someone. It might as well work for someone. I stood in my shop, sawdust on my arms, and I asked her to tell me more about Derek's financing. She got quiet the way people get quiet when they've rehearsed an answer but you didn't ask the question they rehearsed for. Then she said, "Why do you always have to make everything into a deposition? Can you just for once trust that I know what I'm doing?" I told her I trusted her fine. I told her I trusted her enough to want to understand what I was signing my land over into before I signed anything. She said she'd send me the paperwork and hung up. The paperwork never came. What came, 3 days later, was a follow-up call where she told me Derek's financing had gotten complicated, and they might need me to be a co-signer on a construction loan on top of the land transfer. The number she mentioned was $240,000. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks, during which time I also made a few quiet phone calls. One of them was to a fellow I know who does title work in our county, just to understand what signing the land over as equity actually looked like legally, and what it would take to undo if the project collapsed. The answer was, a lot. Maybe everything. The other call I want to tell you about was from a young man named Joel Prater. Joel started at my shop 4 years ago through a vocational program the community college runs for students who want to go into skilled trades. He was 19, quiet, showed up 20 minutes early every single day because, he told me once, his grandfather had told him that showing up early was the only thing in life you could control entirely on your own. His grandfather died his junior year of high school, and Joel had been carrying that piece of advice like it was the last thing he owned from the man. He's 23 now. He has a gift for finish work, the kind of patience with fine detail that you genuinely cannot teach. I've watched him spend 45 minutes getting a single mitered joint right when he could have called it close enough and moved on. He never calls it close enough. He brings lunch in a cooler his grandmother packed for him every morning. He has never once asked me for anything except honest feedback on his work. Every year, without fail, on the anniversary of Patricia's passing, Joel comes in early and leaves a small bunch of wildflowers on the corner of my workbench. He never mentions it. I've never asked him why. Some things you don't need explained. I hadn't made any decisions yet about the land when Christmas came around, and Renee drove up from Charlotte with a rolling suitcase and Derek, who I had not been told was coming. Dinner on Christmas Eve was fine on the surface. I cooked the way Patricia used to, standing rib roast, twice-baked potatoes, green beans from a recipe her mother gave us. Derek talked a lot about markets and opportunity windows. Renee refilled her wine glass several times and watched me the way someone watches a door they're waiting to open. After dinner, while I was doing the dishes, she brought it up again. She stood in the kitchen doorway and she said, "Derek has to give the contractor an answer by January 3rd. We need to know if you're in." I turned off the water. I dried my hands. I told her I wasn't going to sign the land over. Not to a project I hadn't reviewed, not to a financing structure I didn't understand, and not on a timeline someone else's contractor set. What happened next? I want to be careful how I describe, because I know how this is going to sound and I want you to understand that I'm not embellishing it. I want you to understand that what I'm telling you is exactly what happened in my kitchen, in the house I've owned for 27 years, on Christmas Eve. Renee put her wine glass down on my counter. She looked at me and she said, "You know what your problem is? You've been holding on to everything Mom ever touched like it's a museum. The land, this house, the shop. You act like letting any of it move forward is some kind of betrayal of her. She's gone, Dad. The land should be doing something. We should be doing something with it. And you're just sitting in here being sad and calling it loyalty." The kitchen went very quiet. I stood there for a moment. I want to tell you I had something wise ready. I didn't. What came out of me was quiet and very steady, and it surprised me a little, the way your own voice sometimes does when you finally stop holding something. I said, "I think you should head back to Charlotte tomorrow morning." She said, "Excuse me?" I said, "I think you and Derek should head back tomorrow. We can talk after the new year." Her face did something complicated. She started to say something else, and I told her, gently, that I was done with the conversation for tonight. She went upstairs. Derek, to his credit, said nothing at all. They left the next morning before I came downstairs. She didn't say goodbye. There was a coffee cup in the sink, and that was it. I'm going to tell you something that I don't think gets said enough in stories like this one. The silence after someone you love leaves angry is its own specific kind of sound. It's not peaceful. It's not relief, not right away. It's just absence with weight to it, and you feel every pound. I let that silence sit for 3 days before I called Warren Albright. Warren is a local attorney who has handled everything for me and Patricia, going back to when we first bought the shop property in the 90s. He's 70 now, still practices 2 days a week because, as he says, he doesn't know what else he'd do with a Tuesday. I called him on December 28th and I told him what had happened, all of it, including the part where I'd quietly looked into the land transfer mechanics and understood what I'd nearly agreed to. Warren listened the way good lawyers listen, without interruption, without reassurance, just taking it in. When I finished, he said, "George, do you want to talk about your estate plan while I've got you?" I said yes. I want to be straight with you about what happened next, because I know how it looks from the outside, and I want you to understand what was in my head, sitting at my kitchen table on a gray December afternoon, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. I was not angry. I want to be clear about that. What I was finished. There's a difference. Anger is hot, and it wants something back. What I felt was more like the moment you finally set down a piece of equipment that's been running wrong for a long time, and you realize the quiet you're hearing isn't emptiness, it's just what normal sounds like. I told Warren I wanted to restructure. The shop, Hadley Custom Millwork, the building, the land it sits on, the equipment, the client relationships, the name I wanted it to go to, Carol Sims and Joel Prater as equal partners, with the provision that Carol could buy out Joel's share at fair market value if she chose to retire, and that Joel's portion was his outright, no conditions. The 3.5 acres behind the shop I wanted transferred to a land trust in Patricia's name, managed by a local conservation foundation she'd been a supporter of for years, with a deed restriction that kept it as open land in perpetuity. Renee would receive a cash inheritance from my liquid assets, a meaningful amount, genuinely meaningful, the kind of money Patricia would have wanted her daughter to have, but nothing I'd built. None of the land. None of the business. Warren asked me twice if I was certain. I told him I'd never been more certain of anything since the day I signed the original deed on the shop. Renee called 11 times in January. I know because I counted. I let everyone go to voicemail. On the 8th day, she texted, "We need to talk about this." On the 12th day, "You're being completely irrational." On the 19th day, just, "Dad." I read them all. I didn't respond. I called her back on the first Thursday of February, a cold, clear morning, and I asked her to drive up, not to the house, to the shop. I wanted her standing on the floor I'd swept myself for 30 years before either of the people I was about to tell her about ever touched a broom there. I wanted her to understand, in her bones, what she'd been so casual about. She arrived at 4 in the afternoon, 45 minutes late, in a coat I didn't recognize, and with the particular expression of someone who believes they are about to negotiate. Carol was at her desk finishing invoices. Joel was at the back bench doing finish work on a set of cabinet doors, moving a hand plane along the grain with the kind of focus that looks almost like prayer. He glanced up when Renee came in, nodded, and went back to his work. He didn't go anywhere. He just got a little quieter, the way he does when he's paying attention to something he doesn't want to be seen paying attention to. Renee said, without hello, and this is almost exactly the same as it always starts with her, "I drove 2.5 hours. I'd like to know what you want to say." I told her to sit down first. She sat on a stool at the edge of my workbench, the same stool Patricia used to sit on when she'd come in on Saturday mornings to do the books. I don't know if Renee knew that. I didn't say it. I told her about the restructured will. I told her all of it, the shop to Carol and Joel, the land going into conservation, her inheritance. I told her quietly, in order, without commentary. And then I stopped talking and let it land. It took about 4 seconds. "You're giving my inheritance to your employees," she said. I said, I'm giving what I built to the people who built it with me. She said that wasn't fair. She said I was punishing her for one conversation. I told her it wasn't one conversation. I told her it wasn't even about the land. Not really. I told her I'd been watching for years, watching her come by and look at this shop the way people look at a slow clock, waiting for what was inside it without once asking how it kept running. I told her that I'd kept waiting for the question, and the question never came, not once. Not a single time in 31 years had she ever sat down across from me and asked me what this place meant, or what I worried about, or what I was proud of. I told her I didn't say that to hurt her. I said it because I wanted her to understand that what I was doing wasn't a punishment. It was just the truth of things. Finally, after a long time of me pretending otherwise, she was quiet for a moment. And then, and I'll tell you, this is the part of the story I've thought about most in the months since something shifted in her face. Not an apology, not quite, but something that looked like the beginning of a feeling she hadn't let herself have yet. She looked over at Joel, still at his bench, hand plane moving steady. She said, voice lower now, "He's going to get what I was supposed to get." I looked at her for a long moment. I said, "He earns it every day. He shows up. He does the work. He never once assumed anything here was his until the day he made it his by doing the right thing, over and over, when nobody was watching. That's the difference between you and Joel. Not that I love him more. I don't. You're my daughter, and that never changes. The difference is that he never once made me feel like what I built was just something to be waited out." Renee left without saying goodbye, which I had expected. What I had not expected was that before she got to the door, she stopped. She stood there for a second, with her hand on the door frame. The door frame. I'd hung myself, 31 years ago, with a level that had belonged to Patricia's father, and she didn't turn around. But she didn't leave quite yet either. She just stood there, a beat longer than she needed to. Then she walked out into the February cold and got in her car and drove back to Charlotte. I haven't heard from her since. Not through February, not through March. Her birthday came in April. I sent a card, handwritten, and a check for a reasonable amount, because she's still my daughter and I still know who she is under all of it. She cashed the check. She didn't acknowledge the card. I'm telling you that not to make her the villain. She's not the villain. She's just a woman who grew up thinking certain things were guaranteed and is now finding out they weren't, and that is a hard lesson at any age. I won't tell you it doesn't cost anything. The quiet. It does. There are evenings I walk the property line behind the shop, past the tree Patricia planted the year we paid off the building note, and I think about what she would say about all of this, whether she'd think I was right, whether she'd think I'd waited too long. I don't have an answer to that. I've made my peace with not having one. What I do have is this. 2 weeks after the will was finalized, Carol stayed late to go over some numbers with me, and when we were done, she closed her folder and she said, "George, I need to ask you something." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Are you sure about this? About all of it?" And I told her yes. She nodded once. She picked up her folder and her coat and her purse, and at the door she turned around and said, "Patricia would be proud of you." She left before I could answer. And Joel hasn't said anything about it at all. I told him in a brief meeting, just the two of us, laid it out simply. He listened. He didn't react the way I expected. He didn't get excited. He didn't cry, though I half expected that. He just got very still for a moment, the way he gets still when a piece of work is coming together right. Then he looked up at me and he said, "I'll take care of it." 3 words. Same words he says when I hand him a difficult job. And I knew he meant both things at once. The land behind the shop is going into the trust this spring. There's a little creek back there that Patricia used to walk along in the evenings. It'll be open land in perpetuity, no units, no valet parking, no opportunity windows. Just land, doing what land does, which is hold still and let things grow. I drive out to the shop every morning at 6:30. Carol gets there at 6:40 because that's Carol. Joel is usually already there when both of us arrive, doing something that didn't need doing yet but that he figured would be easier to handle before the day got busy. I don't know what I did to deserve either of them. I'm not sure deserving is the right frame for it. Some things in life you don't deserve, You just have the sense to recognize when they're in front of you and hold on. If you've ever had to learn the difference between loving someone and letting them cost you everything you are, if you've ever stood in your own kitchen and heard someone call what you've given your whole life to, just sitting there, then you know what I'm talking about. You know the particular kind of tired that comes before the particular kind of quiet. And you know that the quiet, when it finally comes, is not the same as giving up. It's just what peace sounds like, after a long time of settling for less of it than you deserved. If this one landed with you, hit like. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, parents, sons, daughters, anyone who's ever had to make a call like this, would you have kept the land? Tell me where you're watching from.